Hello, and thank you for tuning in. This presentation is titled Travel and Coming of Age in Novels by Linda Hogan and Kaine Agary. In this presentation, I study the conflation of travel narrative and the coming of age narrative in two novels, Linda Hogan's Solar Storms, published in 1995, and Kaine Agary's Yellow Yellow, published in 2006. These two novels feature young indigenous women as their protagonists, with Hogan's novel set in the upper Midwest region of the USA and Agary's novel set in the Niger Delta region of eastern Nigeria. In both novels, travel across a contested indigenous landscape is integral to their coming-of-age narrative. The protagonist's spatial journey fosters their social and environmental integration into their indigenous community and ultimately into a collective struggle against neocolonial resource grab. In both the texts, the young indigenous protagonists travel well beyond their hometown and by doing so, learn more about the socio-environmental issues facing their indigenous communities. Hence, the spatial journeys not only develop their cultural identity, but also interpolate the young women into ongoing natural resource conflicts. To underline the socialization of young characters into environmental activism and resource struggles, I describe this motif in literature and media as the inheritance of resource struggles. More broadly, the inheritance of resource struggles helps us understand the re-articulation of indigenous identity in narratives of natural resource conflicts in various geopolitical contexts. In both these novels, the protagonists travel across resource frontiers, that is, indigenous homelands that are targeted for resource development and extraction. Though these young characters may not be central to the resistance struggles against neocolonial extractive projects, they are enmeshed in the day-to-day struggles of living, surviving, and coming of age in the resource frontier. The term resource frontier in my usage can be understood to encompass the viewpoint of indigenous characters who reassert their claims on contested spaces and not just as a frontier where extractive industries are looking to expand. My global comparative methodology for studying these two texts uses the word indigenous as an umbrella term that refers to native communities from all over the world. In this presentation, indigeneity encompasses the experiences of Native American characters set in the upper Midwest of the US and Ijo characters based in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. I also use the word indigenous interchangeably with regionally relevant terms such as Native American, Ojibwe, or Cree in the context of Hogan's novel, and Ijo, Ogoni, or Igbo in the case of Agary's novel. This global comparative approach builds, first, a materialist understanding of both these texts as literatures of the world system, in the words of the Warwick Research Collective, as literatures that reflect the material conditions of the world system, as posited by Immanuel Wallerstein. These texts reflect the structures created by globalization. In particular, the works of Hogan and Agary both depict indigenous homelands that have been treated as global commodity frontiers by government and private corporations. Second, my reading of the two novels together builds on a view of world literature as a system of variations, to borrow that phrase from Franco Moretti. Based on Moretti's claims in the now famous article Conjunctures on World Literature, we can think of the novel as an elastic literary form that constantly is negotiated by local cultural ideas. Even as the coming-of-age novel may be a globally legible form, it is adapted to convey the local circumstances of an indigenous homeland. For the purposes of my reading, ideas regarding the central character's coming of age through self-growth is inflected by globally legible conventions, whereas travel and exploration allow the characters to encounter the material and environmental conditions of the resource frontier. Not least, I want to note that comparative readings across places, communities, and neighborhoods are increasingly commonplace in the context of environmental criticism, as seen in the works of Lawrence Buell and Rob Nixon. For instance, in Nixon's reading of Arundhati Roy's For the Greater Common Good, he unpacks the mass displacement of India's indigenous peoples for the construction of a big dam. By reading such situations comparatively, with the dam-induced displacement in Brazil, Guatemala, and China. In this light, Hogan's Solar Storms and Agary's Yellow Yellow are both novels in the English language that aesthetically depict the indigenous responses to various species of what Nixon calls slow violence, including displacement, destruction of livelihood, and social marginalization. Linda Hogan's Solar Storms centers the coming-of-age narrative of Angel, a 17-year-old girl who is recently released from the foster care system in Oklahoma. Set in the early 1970s, the novel begins with Angel being reunited with three maternal figures of her native family: her grandmother Agnes, her great-grandmother Dora Rouge, and her step-grandmother Bush. Angel's grandmother hails from a fictive Native American tribe which seems to have strong affinities with the Ojibwe and the Cree peoples. In the first part of the novel, Angel gets slowly acquainted with her indigenous family members in a fictive coastal town called Adams Rib. Hogan's novel describes the location simply as North Country. The rest of the novel takes place over the course of the next year or so, being narrated from Angel's perspective as she grows into a young adult. Since this is a very formative period in her life, the idea of coming of age remains highly relevant to the narrative. In the town of Adams Rib, Angel learns about her own childhood from her grandmothers and gets acquainted with the rugged lifestyle of the rural environment. Angel's growth as a person is pronounced in the novel's narrative. She begins to look after her great-grandmother Dora Rouge, becoming a caregiver, overcomes body image issues stemming from scars from her face, learns how to swim, and develops a romantic relationship with a boy named Tommy. Crucially, her trajectory of self-growth and acculturation into her indigenous community becomes significantly intertwined with her journey to a fictive place called Two Town. Nearly midway through the novel, Angel embarks on a journey further north from the upper Midwest, ostensibly towards the Boundary Waters region on the Canadian border. Traveling through the wetlands on foot and canoe, Angel is accompanied by her three maternal figures in the novel: Agnes, Dora Rouge, and Bush. Bush's plans for the journey are set in motion after they are informed about the impending inundation of their homes near Adams Rib due to the ongoing dam construction near Two Town. In the third chapter of the novel, Angel's grandmother Agnes is visited by two young native men from the Boundary Waters region. They describe the inundation of Cree and Inuit settlements in the north after the construction of a series of dams by the government and a private company called Beevco. As Angel narrates, quote, "They had heard about plans to build a dam, a reservoir. This year," he told us, "the government and a hydroelectric corporation, Beevco, had decided to construct several dams. In the first flooding," the young man said, "that killed many thousands of caribou and flooded land the people lived on and revered." End quote. While the native settlements, the animals, and the environment in Boundary Waters are already hard hit, newer dams are geared to inundate the coastal region of Adams Rib as well. The environmental justice implications of this onslaught of dams in the novel evokes the actual damming of rivers flowing into the James Bay in the 1970s by Hydro-Quebec, as scholars like Jim Tarter, Laura Castor, and Jeffrey Stacks have studied in detail. Hydro-Quebec's controversial damming projects on La Grande, East Main, and other connected rivers impacted the nearby Cree and Inuit peoples severely. While Angel is gradually learning about her Native American heritage after arriving at Adams Rib, and thus coming into age as an Indigenous woman, this process is dramatically hastened by her spatial journey up north. The trip's destination is Two Town, a rural outpost that is close to the site of dam construction. Bush is the most eager to travel to Two Town to support the indigenous resistance against further dam construction. Angel is motivated to join Bush's endeavor partly in order to learn about her own personal history. Two Town happens to be the current abode of Angel's estranged biological mother named Hannah. Since Hannah is thought to be mentally disturbed and abusive to Angel as a child, it is Bush who has come to be the main maternal figure for Angel after her return home from foster care. This is despite the fact that Bush is not biologically related to Angel. Like the novel's author, Hogan, Bush is of Chickasaw heritage. In this sense, Angel's journey with the three women introduces her to a range of native practices rather than evoking an essentialist conception of indigenous identity. To a large extent, Angel has already found her place in the family at the outset of the travel narrative, as a caregiver to Dora Rouge and as an apprentice to Bush. But the unique nature of her journey north, including 2 weeks of walking and rowing through the wetlands, dramatizes an arduous embodied interaction with the natural environment. In order to skirt the blockades set by the government around Town, where an indigenous struggle against dam construction is already brewing, the four women decide to travel through the wet marshlands by canoe and on foot. They rely heavily on Dora Rouge's previous memory of the journey through the wetlands as they stop at various islands and landmasses along the way. Gradually, Angel learns from Dora Rouge's worldview as they navigate through the wilderness. She narrates, quote, "The world, as described by Dora Rouge, was a dense soup of love creation all around us, full and intelligent. And gradually, I too saw this world as that which gave birth to fish, the great waters parting to make way, as birds left the sea and opened their wings in the air." End quote. In addition to understanding and embracing Dora Rouge's worldview, Angel is also learning important life skills to survive in the unpopulated expanse of the marshland. She and her grandmother supplement their provisions heavily by catching fish and collecting edible plants from the surroundings. Angel describes her first day of travel thus, quote, "At midday, we stopped at the first island to rest and eat lunch. Bush cast out a line and caught 3 shining fish. It was northern pike." End quote. Thus, Angel's identity as an indigenous woman develops more fully through her embodied travel with the 3 maternal figures. In Hogan's novel, the young protagonist's participation in the struggle against dam construction is integral to her new identity as an indigenous woman. Since the coming-of-age narrative is intricately imbricated with travel to the site of natural resource conflict, the struggle against resource grab informs the protagonist's identity as well. I refer to this imbrication of self-growth with participation in a resource struggle for young indigenous characters as the motif of inheritance of resource struggle. Angel's narrative of travel to the site of struggle provides an important facet in her identity development as a young indigenous woman, even when her role in the larger resistance movement is marginal. This argument is in line with my broader claim that resource conflict narratives allow indigenous actors to re-articulate their identity claims in a dynamic manner in response to the resource struggle at hand. Angel's successful coming of age in Town is signaled prominently by her transition to becoming the primary caretaker for an infant named Aurora, who has been left behind by Angel's mother, Hannah, upon her death. So Aurora is Angel's stepsister technically. However, I argue that Angel's role in the struggle against dam construction is more significantly displayed by her mystical powers as a plant dreamer. During her travels, Angel hones her ability to dream about medicinal plants that happen to be nearby and harvest their parts successfully. In Town, she uses this ability to harvest medicinal plants nearby from areas that are soon to be inundated by the rapid dam construction activity. She collaborates with Tulik, an indigenous grandfather who is their host in Town, in order to find the plants she has dreamt about. As Angel narrates in the novel, quote, "We searched for the little elk lichens that grow at the edges where light and shadow meet. We canoed through marshes and waded in the mud. Some of the plants we would cut, others had to be pulled by the roots, but only if there were enough to survive." End quote. While other characters in the novel are more central to the struggle against the dam, Angel's own resistance consists of her careful harvesting of plants, in contrast to the mass inundation of biomass conducted by Beevco. The existent scholarship on Hogan's novel has yielded thoughtful analysis of Angel's journey to Town, connecting the protagonist's journey or her activism with the process of healing from her past traumas. After all, Angel is recovering from the trauma of separation from her mother, as well as the trauma of being abused by her mother as a child. An analysis by Wenji Zhang points out that the familial and the political come together in the narrative of Hogan's novel, with Angel's activism for protecting the land in Town helping to define her identity as an indigenous woman. As Zhang writes, quote, Hogan's novel juxtaposes the healing powers of the landscape with the protagonist fighting for a healing of the landscape. It is through the activism for the protection of the tribal lands that Angela reaches a sense of completion of her identity quests. End quote. Zhang's connection between political activism and identity formation echoes an aspect of the claims that I'm making regarding the inheritance of resource struggles. Further, Jeffrey Stacks and Rosanna Gomez both study the women's arduous journey to Town and its role in helping Angel heal from the trauma experienced in her childhood. Kaine Agary's novel Yellow Yellow is narrated from the perspective of the 17-year-old protagonist Zulaifa, who has recently finished her high school education in a small coastal town in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. The novel is set in the context of the expanding oil economy of the Niger Delta in the mid-1990s. The protagonist Zulaifa lives with her protective single mother in the rural outskirts of Port Harcourt City, which is one of the urban centers of the oil-rich Niger Delta region. Zulaifa comes from the Ijo indigenous community, but her light complexion betrays her mixed heritage. Her biological father, who she has never met, is said to be a Greek sailor who left her mother shortly after their affair. Most of the novel unfolds between 1996 and 1997, after Zulaifa travels from her rural hometown to Port Harcourt City in order to get university education and better economic opportunities. The idea of coming of age remains very significant to the narrative, even as the character of Zulaifa is already a young adult by the time she travels to Port Harcourt. In her hometown, Zulaifa lives under the watchful custody of her mother and a close-knit community. Her travel to Port Harcourt marks a crucial period of self-growth as Zulaifa becomes financially independent from her mother, tries to pursue higher education, and explores her sexuality, eventually as a mistress to an older Ijo man. Even at the outset of the novel, the teenaged Zulaifa is already steeped in the Niger Delta oil conflict, which has impoverished her life in the Ijo hometown. She experiences the environmental toll of oil extraction firsthand when an oil spill from a nearby pipeline destroys her mother's farmland, putting their livelihood at acute risk. The novel's first chapter recalls the oil leak which occurred nearly a year ago. In Zulaifa's first-person narration of the novel, she recounts, quote, during my second to last year in secondary school, one of the crude oil pipelines that ran through my village broke and spilled oil over several hectares of land, my mother's farm included. End quote. Besides destroying farmland, such frequent oil spills have also destroyed the nearby fishing waters, sapping another significant source of livelihood in the Ijo town. Thus, as a young woman, Zulaifa realizes the limited opportunities she has in her hometown, including a very slim chance of getting university education. Zulaifa's personal narrative of moving to Port Harcourt largely reflects the conventions of the Bildungsroman. She determines to leave her hometown, seeing no future for herself there, and eventually convinces her mother to let her go to the city. This initial section of the novel dramatizes Zulaifa's self-growth through her quest for higher education, that is by attending university, and her social acculturation, with new companions in the city who are more attuned to the life of the nation. However, the broader idea of coming of age remains more relevant to my comparative reading, which is why I don't delve into a detailed discussion of the Bildungsroman conventions here. Zulaifa's move to the city, where she remains until the end of the novel, is also informed by her desire for upward social mobility and financial independence. She recognizes that traditional forms of livelihood have been compromised by rampant oil pollution in her hometown, leaving her few options for upwards mobility there. The character narrates, farming and fishing, the occupations that had sustained my mother, no longer provided gain. Women rowed their canoes farther and farther away to find land for farming. End quote. Even as Zulaifa is desperate to leave her hometown, She wants to avoid the fate of other young women who have joined the sex trade in oil boom towns. She realizes that economic desperation has driven other women in her town to become sex workers. She narrates, quote, "I started to consider options that had never crossed my mind before. I could find my way to a place like Bonnie, the base of expatriates working for the oil companies, and sell my body to a whitey. Some girls from my town did that in order to find money to send home to their families." End quote. However, by dint of her high school education and her mother's social connections, Zalefa finds a wealthy patron in Port Harcourt named Cece. A wealthy businesswoman, Cece is sympathetic to Zalefa's ambition and gives her shelter in her mansion in Port Harcourt. Zalefa's coming of age and social integration into the city seems to be very successful initially. She finds a job as a hotel receptionist while she prepares for various university entrance exams in Port Harcourt. Thus, her financial and educational prospects seem to improve, at least temporarily. A crucial aspect of Zalefa's experience is being included in the coterie of her patron's daughter Lolo, who is a successful young businesswoman in her own right. The protagonist recounts, quote, "When I was not working or catching a few hours of sleep, I was content being Lolo's tail and experiencing many new things." By accompanying Lolo, Zalefa is able to mingle with the socialites in Port Harcourt and travel to Lagos for a day trip. In many ways, experiencing the luxuries of life in the city is the flip side of experiencing the depredations of rural Niger Delta for Zalefa. In terms of the geographical layout of the Niger Delta oil conflict, Zalefa's travel to Port Harcourt takes her further away from the site of oil extraction and the Ijo indigenous homeland where its effects are felt most excruciatingly. While the protagonist does not participate directly in the oil politics of the Niger Delta, she is acutely aware that the social and economic benefits of the oil revenue are not being passed down to her coastal hometown. While in her hometown, she remarks on the lack of basic services like sanitation and drinking water due to government negligence. Hence, her travel to the urban center reflects her efforts to explore and enjoy some of the material benefits of oil extraction from the Niger Delta, benefits that are only enjoyed otherwise by the elite few with close links to the military junta government and foreign oil corporations. As Zalefa articulates in her narration, quote, "I was sure that being in Port Harcourt would give me a better chance of getting my piece of the national cake." End quote. Here, a piece of the national cake serves as an apt metaphor for the oil prosperity that appears to be unevenly distributed throughout Nigeria. After finding the patronage of the wealthy family of Sisi and Lolo in Port Harcourt, Zalefa is able to vicariously enjoy some of the luxuries afforded by the oil boom economy in the urban centers. She accompanies Lolo to visit the city of Lagos, where they explore high-end shopping malls, beaches, and other tourist hotspots. Her inclusion in Lolo's social circle, at least momentarily, allows Zalefa a glimpse of oil prosperity. Even as Zalefa looks up to Sisi and Lolo as tenacious businesswomen, their wealth derives from close connections to oil corporations as well as the military junta government. Zalefa's patron Sisi is a contractor for Big Oil Corporation. The novel mentions, quote, "For oil corporations, Sisi supplied everything, from toilet paper to pickup trucks for leash. That was how she made her money." End quote. Lolo, the 25-year-old daughter of Sisi, also aids her mother's business ventures, leveraging her social status to get contracts with oil companies. Thus, Zalefa's journey to Port Harcourt and her social connections in the city enmeshes her in the Niger Delta oil conflict in a very different manner. Zalefa's efforts to claim a piece of the national cake should also be put in the context of the rising ethno-nationalism in the Niger Delta, which often resulted in competing claims over land and oil revenues by neighboring indigenous peoples. The events in Agary's novel are set immediately after the famous execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa by the military government of General Sani Abacha. Saro-Wiwa's writings and his activism demanded a share of oil revenue, as well as environmental protections for the Ogoni people, of which he was a member, and for hundreds of indigenous minorities of the Niger Delta. Zulaifa cites the continued influence of Sarajevo on the local youth as she narrates, quote, "The reports were that Ken Sarajevo's last words on the day of his execution were, 'Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues.' So boys wandered around the village aimlessly dropping the phrase 'A luta continua' at the slightest provocation." End quote. Here, "A luta continua" is the Portuguese slogan that translates to "the struggle continues," made famous by the Mozambican independence movement and the Nigerian student groups. After Sarajevo's death, his rhetoric was emulated by indigenous movements of other minority peoples of the Niger Delta, including the Ijo, Isoko, Urobo, Itsekiri, and Ogbie. These minority movements for self-determination and rights to all revenue are aptly described by Michael Watts as a form of ethno-nationalism. Despite Zulaifa's success in achieving a degree of upwards mobility, her narrative ultimately reveals that she shares some of the desperation and the vulnerability of other women from her hometown. In her quest to become independent from Sisi, financially and socially, the protagonist allows herself to be seduced into an affair with an elderly Navy official referred to just as the Admiral. After wooing Zulaifa with gifts and cash allowances at the start of their affair, the Admiral begins to see Zulaifa as an inconvenience when she becomes pregnant. Thus, the conclusion to Zulaifa's narrative in the novel is not celebratory, rather, it leaves her at a dire crossroads. I suggest that Zulaifa's vulnerability to sexual exploitation by the Admiral towards the end of the novel recalls the lives of the women from her village who became sex workers in oil boom towns in order to improve their lot. Ultimately, Agary's protagonist is enmeshed in a struggle for bodily and sexual autonomy in order to survive the uneven social conditions created by the Niger Delta oil conflict. Thus, to conclude, Hogan's and Agary's novels discuss travel and coming-of-age narratives in the context of struggles against large-scale resource extraction carried out by governments and private corporations. In both works, the narrative of the protagonist's coming of age as a young indigenous woman ultimately re-articulates native identity through unique struggles that are particular to the conditions of the natural resource conflict. Angel's journey to Two-Town in Hogan's novel asks us to retrieve the upper Midwest region of the US as an ecologically vulnerable space from the perspective of its indigenous dwellers. On the other hand, Zulaifa's journey away from the space of conflict in the Niger Delta underlines the precarity of living in a resource frontier in a manner often elided by other forms of environmental criticism. These novels both put toward an embodied discourse of indigenous political struggle which developed the intersection of indigenous rights with the dominant discourse of environmentalism. That's it. Thank you so much for your time and attention.